Good afternoon to everybody. I'm Ian Cribbis. I'm the Secretary of the PeopleSig. I would now like to introduce Dan and Emma from the Applied Influence Group, who are going to conduct this webinar. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Hi, thanks everyone. It's Emma here. Welcome. And I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO of the Applied Influence Group. And I'm here with my colleague Dan, who's our Chief Influence Officer, or CHINFO, as we like to call him. So influence is the ability to affect change in people and in organizations. It's about changing behaviors, how people think, they feel, how they behave, their decisions, their appetite for risk. And it's doing that tactically, so with individuals, and also more strategically across organizations. And Elite Influence, which is our brand of influence, is doing that well, but with precision and doing it skillfully. And we are a specialist influence consultancy, and all that means is we help our clients who are generally large technology, professional services, big industry businesses. We help them solve their toughest influence challenges. And an influence challenge is just the human bit of the business challenges. How do we need to affect change in people to achieve our business outcome? And for those of you that haven't come across us before, the heritage of this elite influence expertise is something called military human intelligence. And in our past life, Dan and I and our colleagues, we were contributing to business challenges to do with disrupting and deterring insurgent networks, with a focus on Afghanistan most recently. And the influence challenges within that were affecting decisions of the intent of senior insurgent leaders, for instance, and sometimes more tactical influence campaigns, such as how do we collect information about where the suicide vests are buried in a particular part of Helmand province, and how do we create influence agents to help us influence those people who are making the strategic decisions. And at the very essence of this job was building trusting and influential relationships really quickly with a whole range of people. So from those senior military insurgent leaders through to local people, Taliban judges, local illegitimate government, young indoctrinated insurgents who had only known a life inside of a Taliban madrasa, a training school camp. And so we needed to build trust and influence and persuade them ethically, quickly. And the framework that we established to do this through these intense experiences is how we did that. It's how we persuaded them. And we're going to show you some of that today. It's not specific to high stakes situations or crisis environments. It clearly transcends that, but there are some additional considerations when we're in such high stakes environments, which we're going to touch on, particularly to do with threats and how threats change a person's motivation. And what we found in Afghanistan was that this framework around persuading and motivating was just as useful to us internally, as well as with our Taliban, our day-to-day job, because every day we would have to go into battle internally with the policyholders and the politicians and our leadership to fight our corner around taking certain risks or not taking certain risks. And the tools that we developed day-to-day job with the Taliban were just as useful here. And that's because we're all human, so it doesn't matter who's on the other end of the interaction and being persuaded, we're all human, so it's just as relevant. And that's what our business has done, is we've codified that expertise so we can replicate it. And specifically today, we are talking about persuasion and at a tactical level, how we can harness a person's motivation. So more on that in a mo. So me personally, so I served 5 tours of Afghanistan. 4 of those were in a human intelligence role. I started off my career actually as an engineer officer and served a tour of Afghanistan, running all the radars, navigation aids on Camp Bastion. And then I came across this human capability, and I found it so fascinating that I stayed there for the rest of my career. And then I left a few years ago to co-found the Applied Influence Group with Dan and a few others. And Dan, a short intro from you, please.
So yeah, my name's Dan Connors. I served a full 22-year career in the British Army. And that photo that you can now see on screen is not me at the end of lockdown. That was me at the end of a 6-month operational tour where I've been spending 16 to 18 hours a day working to influence these individuals 7 days a week in a really intense situations, where if we were successful, we saved life, and if we weren't successful, we didn't. I started as a frontline infantry soldier and served 8 years in a variety of places, predominantly time in the Balkans. In 2001, I moved into the world of intelligence, done a wide variety of roles, and I actually ended up in what would be considered a learning and development role in the military, taking people fresh from civilian street. They've been through their basic training to learn to be soldiers, and they came to me to learn to be intelligence professionals. And I found that working with those young soldiers and young officers, I was using exactly the same influence skill set to make people understand that they were capable of doing the things that we needed them to, that sometimes they needed to adjust their behaviour to be successful, and that really things were possible that they didn't think were. And that was using exactly the same skill set as I had done, sat in a room with a Taliban commander, trying to influence him to change his mindset. I've been with the Applied Influence Group since the beginning. I said I completed a full military career. That actually means I'm now a pensioner, but Emma won't let me retire and influences me to continue working with us. We've had a fantastic 4 years, taking this methodology that we built in that situation to a really, really wide variety of clients and helping them with their challenges.
Awesome, thanks, Dan. So why does it matter to consider desires, fears and threats, and particularly in high stakes situations, crisis situations, situations that are changing quickly? Well, at a time of change and uncertainty, that leads to us as humans perceiving a greater number of threats. And more on what we mean by a threat in a moment. But threats trigger fears, and fears are a powerful motivator and can change our behaviour and can be a dominant factor in what's driving our behaviour. And as these threats change and they develop, they evolve, they increase, they decrease as the situation changes, our behaviours continue to change as a result. And knowing this, understanding that matters, because targeting your message, your influence message to a person shaped around their motivations, which includes their fears, that is a really powerful and effective way to persuade. And you're much more likely to resonate and chime with that person's perspective on the world than you would be if you were to give them a message that is quite general and lines up with how you see things, not necessarily how they see things. So there's no more specific and impactful way to do this than speaking directly to a person's intrinsic desires and fears. And we call those internal influence factors, those desires and fears. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So remember, I said earlier, an influence challenge is just the human bit of the business challenge. It's how we need to affect change in people to achieve our business outcome. So as we move through this today, and Dan's going to take us through our framework around those internal influence factors, have in your mind a current influence challenge, a person that you need to persuade in a certain way. It could be a colleague, a boss, a client, a partner, organization, an internal stakeholder. Have that person in your mind and be applying this framework to that situation straight away, because the sooner you put it into practice, the more likely it is to stick, because you can have all the influence, knowledge and tools in the world, but if you don't put it into practice, it's absolutely no good to you, of course. So this is our overall methodology. This is how we think about influence in a framework. So the first thing we think about is the cultural canvas in which we're influencing. And there's 3 dimensions to that. There's the cultural aspects to an organisation, and many organisations that might be involved in a situation that we need to consider. There's cultural heritage of the individuals and the relative differences of their cultural norms to us, or those that are influencing them, and how we need to adapt to that. And then there's the cultural norms of the place that in which we are influencing. Once we've understood our cultural canvas, we then consider our influence strategy. So this is quite a rich area of our methodology. There's 7 key questions that we use to form an influence strategy. But really, this is about how do we coordinate a whole multitude of influence effects, so how we need to change people to a wide variety of stakeholders, probably across lots of different organisations, and how do we make sure that they're being deployed in the right sequence by the right person, we've got the right resources. So it's how do we coordinate lots of different influence effects to achieve a strategic outcome. And then there's planning, and planning is the thing that bridges our strategy and turning that into effective and efficient influence activity at a tactical level. And then in the middle there we have, how do we influence a person more tactically? So we consider how we understand them, how we communicate with them, and how we influence them. There's some behavioural skills in there as well. And all we're going to cover today is one aspect from the influence section of that middle bit, how we influence a person individually. And this framework, this diagram here represents 10 years operating in Afghanistan by a couple of hundred people and hundreds of thousands of hours. This is everything that we've learned. We've discarded everything that was superfluous, and this is the essence of it distilled. But all we're talking about is internal influence factors, and whilst it's a tiny bit, it's still really valuable to you, and it will still make a big difference to how persuasive you are if you apply it. So what we're going to cover today is this desires, fears, and threats topic in internal factors. And the value of that to you is these 3 points here. So it's going to allow you to understand better why people's behaviours are changing and what's triggering those, and therefore what you can do about that, if indeed that's the right thing to do. It's going to help you be more compelling to individuals and to wider groups of people by using the motivations that you've assessed within a person's filters, if you like. And then thirdly, it's going to make us more efficient, and it's going to allow us to achieve more with less interactions. And in this time of uncertainty, and particularly with remote working, it's more important than ever to be able to do these 3 things. So we're going to start with a question for you, and I'll hand over to Dan.
Okay, so my question to you is, what motivated you to attend this special briefing today? So what motivated you to be here to listen to me and Emma talking? So Sophie said to bridge a knowledge gap. Bruce is talking about influencing change. Leslie wants to be more effective with colleagues. Ram's interested in understanding how the army communicates with us. Improved communication, general interest, additional methods to create change. So some really good answers. Influencing people is critical to successful projects. Thank you, Edward. So Kelly's got a specific problem with a client. Elaine said, remote working makes me lose the physical interaction and how to read and handle people. So loads and loads of different reasons that you've given up an hour of your time to listen to me talk about kind of what I know. And that's really interesting because you're all here for the same event, but many of you want quite different things. There's some overlap there, but actually you're all going to benefit. And what I'm going to show later on, and think about your answer when I do, is how you can tie back the framework that we've got to understanding people's motivation. So you've got a motivation for being here, and they're quite varied, and we can apply this framework to pretty much anything. So later on, I'm going to ask you to think about that answer that you've given me and apply it back to the framework that I'm going to explain to you. When I first deployed to Afghanistan, I thought that everyone had joined the Taliban for ideological reasons or religious reasons, kind of had this viewpoint that they were there to try to kick the infidel invader out of their country. And very, very quickly, it became apparent that that was really wrong, and that perception was fundamentally flawed. And we really, really quickly needed to understand why people were doing these things, why people were taking action that were often really, really detrimental to their own communities. So for every British or American casualty in Afghanistan, about 19 local people either lost a life or suffered a life-changing injury. And it was having a much bigger impact on them. And this was being done by people who lived within their communities, and really trying to understand why was critical to our success. And I started to write down a list of why, when I was talking to these people, they were telling us why they got involved in the insurgency. And often there'd be an element of subterfuge there, but it became apparent quite quickly that there were a real variety of reasons as to why they'd done it and what they desired. And we started to have this list, which was really useful, because then when we interacted with someone new, we had a framework of practical, tangible reasons why someone had done it. And we could start asking ourselves maybe which category they fitted into. Now, Emma said that that methodology took us 10 years to build, and I didn't spend 10 years in Afghanistan. We'd go in for a period of operational activity. We'd then come back to recuperate and do other roles. And in that time back in the UK, spent a lot of time engaging with academia, with people in other professions fairly similar, such as law enforcement and things like that, but also some people that you might not necessarily consider. So people like counsellors, social workers we interacted with, to try and find out how they understood people and how they tried to influence them. And in one of those sessions, I came across a theory, a psychological theory, from a guy called Stephen Rees. And Rees was an American psychologist, and he'd ended up being hospitalized for quite a long period of time. And during his hospitalization, he couldn't really work out why the nurses in this American hospital, who were really quite poorly paid, were so motivated to do such a good job. And he received some excellent care. And he decided, lying in his hospital bed, to do some research when he recovered. And he did. He put together a research team, and they interviewed several thousand people, mainly in a Western setting, but not entirely. And through doing some sort of word analysis on asking people, you know, what do you desire? Why do you do the things you do? He came up with, or him and his team came up with 16 desires. And when I was introduced to this, I could look at this framework, and it really, really closely linked with all that list of reasons that we'd found for why people joined the Taliban. And actually what it gave us was more of an underpinning. So often we do things to meet needs that we're not necessarily conscious of, and therefore there'll be an underlying motive behind it. And what I'll talk you through is the 16 things that Rees came up with. So the first thing that he talks about is power. And that word can often come with fairly negative connotations, but power is really about just being in control of a situation, being able to control others or the outcome of a situation. And that's really what some people desire. All of these desires might exist within us in some measure, but in some individuals, certain ones of these desires will be much stronger. People will actively seek out situations to enhance those. So some people, it will all be about being in control. And when you're engaging on a project, you might come across some stakeholders who that's what it's about. It's just about being in control. And if they feel that they are, that they've retained control, then they're going to get what they desire. Status can often be linked to power, but not always. Some people are just after the trappings of a position or want to be perceived to have status, but aren't really bothered about being in control. So in the world that we lived in, there were local positions such as village elders. And for some of those people, it was about power and control. For some, it was about the status that that position gave them. For some people, maybe lower down in the hierarchy in those organizations, actively seeking out status was what they did. And sometimes the Taliban could really offer them things that would allow them to do that. So being in the Taliban gave some young men in particular a status that they wouldn't have had if they were just a farmer. And in business, it's exactly the same. So some people are just worried about having the best office or having the title, and actually being in control of situations is kind of secondary to that. For some people, it's about independence, and that's about not being constrained by others. And again, this is something that when we're working with transformation programs, we often find that is a desire that kind of butts up against what might be going on with the program, whatever that might be, that people feel their independence is being constrained. And if you can empower people to still be able to independently act, for those individuals, that might make them much more inclined to go along with the project and really buy into it if they feel that that's been taken into consideration. For some people, it's about winning or vengeance, and the two are really closely linked. Rees talks very closely about vengeance, but there was some subsequent work done by an Olympic coach using Rees's framework, who found that athletes scored really, really highly on this. So it's about winning, it's not about not being beaten by someone. And we've probably all worked with someone at some point in our careers who has to win at everything. And it doesn't matter if that's winning promotion or winning a bonus, or if it's winning the office cake competition, they hate being beaten. And again, it might be that allowing that person to win might be the way that we can frame something so that we get actually what we need, get them to do, is if they perceive that as a win for them. For some people, it's about acceptance, sometimes even at compromising maybe their morals to do that. They just want to be accepted by a group and will kind of do anything to do that. So these might be the people who'd be really reluctant to speak up if they thought it would be unpopular, who might be really reluctant to do something divergent from a group, and they just want to be accepted. Some people, it's about order, things always being done in a certain way, or people certainly being sure that things will be done or things will be where they need them to be at a particular time, and sort of disruption to this will drive a threat in them. For some people, it's about saving and accumulating resources. And again, we've probably all worked with someone who had the entire offices, if you remember those days when we had offices, who had their entire offices stationery cupboard in the bottom drawer of their desk, even though the stationery cupboard was in the office and they could get something anytime they wanted. And that's someone who's saving and accumulating resource is really, really important. In the wider business setting, this might be people keeping hold of people resources that they no longer need, so they don't want to release someone from their team because they've got that resource now and they want to accumulate it. It might be about budget, things like that, and that's what it's about. Many of these desires have an evolutionary underpinning, and the saving or accumulating resources one seems to date back to when we were on the plains of Africa and we never knew where our next hunter-gatherer meal was coming from, and therefore the desire to save and accumulate things becomes really strong. For some people, it's about honour and doing the right thing at the right time, regardless maybe of the personal consequence. So some people will try to achieve their desire for honour over personal gain. Some people, it's about idealism, making the world or their organisation or the thing that they're working on better. And again, this might come at personal cost to them, but this can be a really powerful desire if it's aligned to what it is that we're trying to do, and we can tap into it, because people will put the idea ahead of themselves if this is a strong desire in them. For some people, it will be. For some people, they may have no idealistic desire at all, and it might be quite self-centered. Some people, it's about social contact and being around other people. And when I talk about threats in a minute, this is something that we've seen across our client base, that people who actively crave social contact have really been struggling at times during the various lockdowns in the different countries that they've been in, and have tried to find ways to kind of get around that. But video conferencing really seems to not quite hit the mark for some of that. So we all crave social contact, regardless of how introverted we are. And I'm quite a strong introvert, but we all crave some form of social contact. But for some people, it's a really big part of what they're trying to achieve and the desires they're trying to fill. Some people, it's about curiosity. Many of you in the when I asked you to comment on kind of why you were here today, there was an element about curiosity. This is about acquiring new knowledge, acquiring new skills. And certainly one of the biggest cases that I was involved in Afghanistan, for a fairly large scale smuggler, his number one desire was curiosity. He was fascinated to learn about the world outside of Afghanistan that he hadn't really seen, to know what it was like to live in the West. And that was really, really something that we could message around, and we could use to build reciprocity in him by satisfying some of that curiosity. So for some people in a project setting, it might be around, if you can meet that curiosity, that desire to learn something, to learn a new skill or gain knowledge, that might be the way that you get buy-in from that individual. For some people, it's about tranquility and just having the kind of peace and quiet that they like. People find their own tranquility in different ways. One of our colleagues, who's one of the other co-founders, his tranquility is probably 3 a.m. in a London nightclub, with the noise going really loudly. I can't think of anything worse, and kind of my tranquility is found in the countryside by myself. But if tranquility is a motivation and a strong desire, kind of trying to find ways to meet that and not go against it can be really important. And then at the bottom, we have some of the more base desires that if you're familiar with something like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, might seem fairly similar. So things like romance, eating, physical exercise, and family that might seem to be less relevant to a project setting, but might still come into play, and kind of how we think about them. And family is one that increasingly kind of touches on the workplace, particularly with many more of us working from home and the impacts of that. So that was Reese's framework, and we found it really, really useful to apply that, to look at how that matched against the reasons that we found for why people had joined the Taliban. And if I give you one example, there was a young 18-year-old Taliban fighter who'd been caught red-handed with a small improvised bomb on his moped. So there was no way he could deny being in the Taliban. And talking to him about why he joined the Taliban, it turned out that he was the third son of 5, and his 2 brothers weren't married yet. So it's going to be quite some time before he could leave the family unit and the family compound and gain his full independence. We found out that that family was quite poor, and because he was the third son, he particularly had quite low status, and therefore that was something that when we explored this a bit more, he really, really craved. And he really craved social contact. And his family compound was about an hour and a half's walk from the next small village, and therefore to see people his own age, even when he was allowed to leave the compound, took quite a lot of effort. By giving him a moped, which was why he joined the Taliban had touched into these desires, and I don't think they understood Reese's framework, but they're very intuitive communicators. They touched into his desire for independence. He could get away more easily. He could get to meet his friends much more easily and be there in 10 or 15 minutes. And this gave him some status that he didn't have. So when I was messaging him, we needed to touch much more into that. So that's the desires, and that was really Reese's framework. But what Reese didn't talk about that we found in our experience was fear. And fear is a much more powerful emotion. It releases different chemicals into the bloodstream when we feel threatened by something, and that fear emotion emerges. But fear only comes about when there's something that we perceive to be a threat. And there are 3 ways that we think that threats emerge. There might be a change to the situation. So something like a global pandemic, a coronavirus comes along, and that might change a load of threats within us. It might be that someone else has stimulated a threat. So by saying something, they've highlighted a threat to someone that they didn't know existed. That might be a genuine threat that they just hadn't perceived, or it might be something that doesn't exist but has been stimulated by what they've said. So in the current environment where many businesses are now looking at reducing headcount, someone saying, I heard the boss was talking that the team is going to be slimmed down, that might stimulate a threat in many people within that team. And it might not be true, that might not be going to take place, but that will stimulate a threat that wasn't there before that individual said it. And the third way in which threats can trigger fears is that they can be self-induced. So we're very good at creating threats where none exist, either by playing back something that was said over and over in our mind. We might generate things that weren't really there. We can often read a threat into something like an email where someone has written that email in a particular way, not intending it to come across in any kind of negative way, entirely in an adult-to-adult way. But when we've read it as a threat, and that's generated a fear in us. So we can be very good at self-inducing threats where they don't really exist, or where we hadn't realized that they were there before. And that's what we found, was that there were these 3 different ways that these threats were identified, and what those threats led to was fears. And so these are the 3 ways that we get them: the change in situation. So that might be a change in an influence factor, a new element of danger in a situation. Change in a composition of a group can often trigger threats in a change in situation. Stimulated can be when we interact, even if the situation hasn't changed. And then those self-induced ones, again, specifically where they don't exist, situation might not have changed at all. So thinking about that I've just talked about, and coronavirus and the big impacts of that, in the question box, can you please put in some of the threats that you are seeing emerging or that you think are there that weren't there 4 or 5 months ago, but that you're now experiencing either with yourselves or with stakeholders? And I'll give you 30 seconds to do that. So we've got job security, economic uncertainty, change to project spend, reduced budget, self-isolation, fears of a second lockdown, quite a lot around job security there, not being able to undertake site visits, so that might trigger a whole load of different threats, delay in decision making, perception that if we're not in the office, we're not working, catching the virus itself, absolutely. So I think we've all experienced that. My wife works in a hospital. So, you know, there's an ever-present threat there. She's in quite a high-threat environment. Is the threat real? So, interesting suggestion there. Difficulty in stakeholder communications. So, we found a whole list of threats that have emerged purely from this. And this is just using COVID as an example, but any new project or program that you're working on will also generate its own threats that weren't there before that started. So, using Corona as an example, these are some of the threats that we've identified. So it might be that we've got that current business activity. People don't know if they're going to be in a job. Is that business activity still going to be there? Are we going to have to let people down? Are we having much more difficult conversations than we were before because things have been delayed or we can't do what it is that we've committed to? So some of those threats around that current business activity, maybe because we can't visit on site, we're having to let people down. It might be much more personal, that we've got ill relatives or ourselves, and I think someone put mental health in the chat. Absolutely, I'm seeing and hearing major impacts for lots of people in that realm, and I'm not enjoying many aspects of lockdown, even though we kept working quite well throughout. Self-isolation is something that some people are viewing directly as a threat. Other things like how do you manage homeschooling or providing childcare at the same time as trying to work, when previously, you know, your child might have gone to the nursery. Now we've had all those interruptions, and my 2 teenagers are on strict warnings during this webinar not to walk in or interrupt me. I've even throttled the bandwidth to their Xboxes and to Netflix, so hopefully you can keep hearing me throughout. But some of those interruptions can be really disruptive. It might be around working practices, and I think someone put loss of control into the chat. So we might not be in control of our teams because we can't see them day to day, might be a bit more difficult to manage. Maybe we've had people furloughed and there are now really increased demands on us and we're having to do more or do things that we weren't comfortable with before, and therefore having to fulfill new requirements that just weren't present or that we're not used to doing, and we feel threatened by that for one of many reasons. It might be around planned or future activity. So are we losing opportunities? You know, did we have a promotion that was nailed on this year and we were definitely going to get, and now that's been put on hold? Were there some personal impacts of spend control on the projects or the programs that we're working on? There are a whole host of different threats, and there might be some that are really specific to your business that we haven't touched on. But if you can identify those threats, what you can then start to do is to work out which fears are being triggered by them. And fears that Reese didn't talk about, they're just the opposite of the things that he did talk about as desires, but they're felt in a very different way. And you know, when we feel fear from a very, very low level to extreme peril, it releases different quantities of threat hormones into our bloodstream, and that happens whatever level that fear is taking place. So impotence is the opposite, the opposite fear to power. Insignificance is the opposing fear to status. Reliance and subordination is the opposite to independence, and so on and so on. If we're really motivated by winning, and we're now seeing loads of threats around disappearing opportunities, we might be really feeling that fear of defeat. And it might not manifest itself exactly as that. It might be something more tangible, like, you know, this opportunity's gone. But actually, it's that fear that's been triggered of losing and of being defeated that's really driving that concern. Some people might view the loss of that opportunity as, so, you know, that's just the way it goes. I'm still fit. I'm still healthy. I've still got my family. And that might just be because they don't feel triggered. They don't feel that threat because their motivations sit in a different way. Now, you might be sat there thinking, well, you know, that's all well and good, but how does that actually help me when I'm messaging? Well, this all comes down to how we frame our message and how do we speak to that individual or to that small group of individuals that maybe we're trying to interact with. And in framing, we might have our influence challenge, and I've got an example here. So we might have a key stakeholder who we want to accept some risks associated with a new service. So it might be something to do with the project that we're working in, that we need to bring in a new service to achieve that, but there might be some risks to business as usual activity or something like that by bringing this in. And what we do first of all is we write down our basic message. That if we could have absolutely frank conversation with people, this is what we'd say. And our basic message might be, you're in good hands. The benefits of this are really worth the risks. And that's the message that we want to convey. And it might be that in this stakeholder, we've identified that they have a real desire for order, so things always being done in a certain way. And actually, there's a real threat at the minute that's triggered real fear of conflict. So this individual is having to have lots of challenging conversations on a daily basis. They really dislike that conflict. And actually, this thing that you're proposing that might have some risk with them, that's just triggering loads more threats of, oh God, I'm going to have some more of those conflicts, those difficult conversations that I really, really dislike. And therefore, with that message, we can either add to that desire or we can take it away. We can remove it. And we can frame exactly the same basic message in 4 different ways. So we might add to that desire for order by saying when this is implemented, things are just going to run much more smoothly. So you're going to get that order that you've always wanted, and it'll be there. Everything will be really smooth once we get through it. It might be that we need to add to their fear. And adding to a fear sounds unethical. But actually, if there's something that someone should genuinely be concerned about, and they're not, because they don't recognize that it's something they should be concerned about, increasing the fear in that individual is absolutely appropriate and ethical, because we need to make people aware of things that might go wrong. So here we might be saying, you know, the issues with the current platform that we're using to manage this are just going to keep causing friction in the business, and you're going to have to keep having these difficult conversations that you really, really don't like. So that's increasing someone's fear and making the other option, which is going with, you're in good hands, we can sort this out, the risks are worth it, seem much more appealing. But we can also take things away. So it might be that we remove fear, and we might say, look, we'll deal with any short-term issues caused by the implementation. So if anything goes slightly wrong, send them to me. I can have those difficult conversations, and you're just going to reap the benefits. You're not going to have to do any of that. It might be that we remove their desire, and this is kind of playing down. You're not really going to get what you want. So you're going to miss out on an opportunity if you don't do this now to really get that stable platform that you've been after. And that is exactly the same basic message where we either add to or remove a desire or fear to make it really, really resonate. And if we can do this at the individual level, so one-on-one conversations with stakeholders that we know, then we can really, really tailor that message to make it super personal. It might be that we're dealing with a bit of a wider group where we need to identify some common fears and desires amongst that group. And it might be that in our communication, we're actually weaving in a number of these different themes around the different desires and fears that we've identified in that group so that it resonates with all those people. And outside of transformation, we do a lot of work with high-value business selling. And one of our long-term clients, he had built a relationship with an existing client that he was delivering to. He was trying to sell something new into them, that was going to a formal pitch process. He had 30 minutes with a panel of 5 people. He'd identified some different desires and fears within the 5, and different bits of that 30 minutes, he was focusing different messages assigned to different desires and fears to different individuals on that panel. And he won what was the biggest bit of business that client won in that country that year. And he ascribes that success to applying that framework. And it's exactly the same when we work with people doing transformation, is that if you can identify who your blockers are and therefore remove the fear or add to their desire, you can often remove some of those challenges that go with working with a really difficult stakeholder landscape. So that's our framework of desires and fears, and really just kind of open it up to the floor now.
Dan, we've got 2 questions coming in at the moment. One from Edward. He asks, with respect to the Reese's framework, where does acknowledgement fit in within the framework?
I'm taken by that you're talking about acknowledgement of effort or being recognised for something that you've done, or maybe for having a viewpoint acknowledged. So that might depend slightly on which desires and fears are relevant. So it might be around acceptance, might fit into that. It might be that if actually the acknowledgement that my viewpoint is right is what's important, that might tie into power. So I think acknowledgement could probably sit into a number of different fields depending on the individual and what it is that they're wanting to be acknowledged. And I don't know if you've got a specific example, Edward, there that you could, maybe just apply a little bit more context. So I might be able to answer that in a slightly different way. But there are some desires that people say things like, well, where does money fit into it? And money's just an enabler. So money might allow some people to get the status that they're after. It might allow some people to get the independence that they need to move out from living with their parents, for example. For me, if money wasn't an object, it would give me the tranquility to move out to the countryside and not have to work and be able to go and kind of do the nature conservation, which is what I like doing in my spare time. Hopefully that answers your question, Edward.
Thanks, Dan. Susan makes a comment that the working world is changing as a result of the COVID-19, and people have unforeseen fears. How do employers manage that and be proactive in their solutions?
So I think often recognizing that there are lots of different threats out there and kind of trying to be open about trying to find out what those are. So, a key thing for us when we're engaging back in Afghanistan, a key thing for engaging with clients is kind of understanding what are the threats that different people are facing. So within a workforce, there will be a lot of different threats. And we did a session with a client recently, looking with a group of them at their kind of incentivization scheme and how the current situation was changing some of the threats related to that. And really just asking lots of really good questions to try and find out what those threats are. That requires a good understanding of those individuals or a relationship where you can ask those open questions. And one technique that we use that would sit in the communication part of that model that Emma showed you at the start is around elicitation and listening. And that we think is a really key skill. And people often talk about the value of open questions. But we think there's a layer that's even better than that, which is using the words tell, explain, or describe. So if you're running a team or managing a team and you think there are new threats and fears there, things like explain how this situation has impacted on you is going to get a much more narrative response that will highlight the things that are right at the top of that person's thought process than kind of what are you scared about now. So using tell, explain, describe can be a really good way of trying to get to the bottom of what it is that's really driving that.
Thanks, Dan. We've got one in from Neil. How can you find out background information on people that you've never met or spoken to, but need to influence them from time to time for important transactions?
Okay, so we have in the understand phase of our model, we have something called the DNA of influence, which is a way of profiling people or building up a rich picture. We talk about a number of different ways that you can do that. It might be that you ask people who know them. That comes with its own issues, that individuals will have their own biases about other people. It might be that we just go and speak to them and, you know, have a fact finding, get to know you call first. I think in some ways remote working has, you know, in some ways made that a little bit easier sometimes. There's a bit more justification sometimes for doing that. Or we might look at someone's social media. So I don't have the example to hand, but when we're delivering people development sessions, one of the examples that I would give here would be Emma's LinkedIn profile. And if you look at Emma's LinkedIn profile, you'll see that she's got a strong engineering background. She's done several project management qualifications. And what you might be able to deduce from that, or you might make an assumption that you could then find out if that was right or wrong, might be that process and order and precision are really important to Emma. And actually they are. So if I've got some oddball idea of something I think the business should be doing, I really, really need to think about how can I frame that message in a way that ties into that desire for order and Emma's, you know, understanding, very right understanding and belief that you need an element of order in a new growing business. Otherwise, we just end up wasting lots of resources. So if you want to add anything there, Em.
I completely agree. Yeah, and it's always a good example. And I think there's, I think you'd be surprised. My observation is that once you have this framework and you look at a person's social media profile, LinkedIn, Facebook, and you draw some of those assumptions, which you can then hypothesis test, as Dan said, you'd be amazed at how much you can glean from just a basic LinkedIn profile. And you might have to, you know, adjust your assumptions as you get to know a person better. But it's a really rich, can be a really rich source, particularly clearly in this day and age when there's lots of information available in the open source world.
And, you know, another live example of that at the minute, particularly if you're working at a fairly senior level. So we're doing some consulting at the minute with a global tech company on one of their accounts. And they've got a particular stakeholder who they've yet to meet. They're aiming to meet him. This is within the tech space that they're looking at selling a strategic solution to this organization. And I found a really good video of him talking about what he thinks the benefits of tech in his sector are, some of the issues with it, and video, particularly if you're dealing with really senior stakeholders, increasingly becoming a possibility. So many people have now spoken at a conference or you know, they've delivered a webinar, for example, and from that video you can really pick up mannerisms and speech, and people are often being asked to talk about the things that are really important to them and giving viewpoints so you can understand maybe their attitudes and beliefs a lot better. And video is a really underused resource in our experience.
And just to add to that, Dan, a good exercise for this is to apply this framework to yourself and to your teams that you know well, and then see what you can ascertain desires and fears wise for those that you don't know well. So, for instance, you know, straight after this, if you go to Dan here, go to Dan's Facebook page. It's an open page, and look at the imagery that Dan has on the lockdown page, and see what desires you think are relevant for Dan. And this is an exercise that I do with some of the presentation stuff that we do, and it's amazing how accurate. I know Dan very well, but it's amazing how accurate people that have never met Dan before can be when they're applying this framework just based off the imagery that Dan chooses to show on his Facebook page. So I'd encourage you to do that with yourselves and the people you know well and less well.
Thanks. We've had one in from Edward who says, historically, managers have been advised to avoid detractors for fear of losing waivers. What steps within this will help to avoid it?
So I think if you can identify why the detractors, you know, how that ties into their personal motivations is are they detracting because they view something as a threat? There might be a valid business reason why they're a detractor, difference of opinion. But again, if you can frame your message into that way, then you can turn very fixed detractors to supporters. And we've worked with some of the people who have, possibly one of the most fixed mindsets in the world. I've walked into to speak with someone who, an hour before I'd spoken to them, had been trying to kill some of my colleagues in Afghanistan for ideological reasons and by building trust. And I know that's a question from someone else. By building trust and then being able to message to that individual, you can turn around some of those detractors. Emma talked about sort of the influence strategy in our overall model. And it might be that if you're dealing with a complex situation where you need to influence lots of stakeholders, you might make the assessment that actually the time that you need to invest in that is not going to be productive use of your time, and actually there are better ways of achieving it. So it might be that if you can influence the people around that detractor, then you don't need to impact them, and that might be a way of doing it, because it can take considerable effort to influence someone who's very fixed in their opinions, and might take time that you don't necessarily have. And therefore, maybe working around them and working out who those waverers might be, and focusing your efforts on them might be a more productive way of addressing the issue.
Yeah, you've touched a little bit on that, Dan, but Ram is saying, how do we maintain trust throughout the process?
I think being authentic is really, really important. And often a quick way of building trust is in showing trust. So often the people that I would be engaging with, I would be talking about myself. There were security considerations that we had where we were operating. So, I wouldn't talk about my children and their real names, but I would talk about the fact that I had children and, the life that I lived in and some of my concerns and some of my fears. And actually by trusting the individual with something, that can be a good way of building trust. Being authentic and not lying to people is really important. I think a lie or being caught out in a lie is absolutely the easiest way to lose trust. So if you're influence messaging on something that you don't think you can deliver, then that's really, really risky. And by asking people, the first bit in the behavioural model that I will just bring up now, just so you can all see it again. So the first bit in that inner bit around the behavioural skills around working with individuals is about understanding the individual. And if you can understand people, then that builds trust in themselves, because you've taken the time to learn what their preferences are, what their attitudes and beliefs are, what their their concerns and their perspective on the situation. And even if you end up having to do something different, having spent that time to understand someone is going to be a way that will build trust, because they will feel engaged in the process. And I did a session last week on how you can apply some of this stuff to leadership, and I always talk about my first platoon commander when I was in the infantry, and we joined at about the same time. So I was a fresh-faced young rifleman, and he was a fresh-faced young second lieutenant, and he's always the person that I think about as being a good leader. And the reason for that was that he always listened. And he always made time to understand our perspective. And even if he ended up doing something completely different to what I'd suggested might be a good idea, or what someone else in the platoon might have suggested was a good idea, we always felt included in the process in a genuine, authentic manner. And that built the trust that we would go and do what he eventually decided on, because we knew he'd understood the perspectives and had genuinely considered them. So hopefully that answers your question there, Ram.
Thank you, Dan and Emma. Before we draw this webinar to a close,
just a reminder, we've only really touched on one segment of our methodology. If you're interested in finding out any more about what we do, there's some stuff on our website. Feel free to contact me on that email address if you're interested in having a further conversation. And there are some resources and some videos on our website that you can look at
Dan, Emma, thank you very much for a most interesting presentation. I learned quite a lot on that, and thank you very, very much. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and your participation.